Welcome to the last session of the 2024 HEI Annual Conference. I'm Ted Russell. I'm a professor at Georgia Tech, and I'm one of the co-chairs of this session. So with that, I mean, it's great to see how many of you are still here, and I think that speaks well both to the quality of the HEI conferences, how well they treat us, as we just experienced, and actually the importance of this last topic. Just looking at it, HEI has this long history of doing policy-relevant research. And I think that there's nowhere that this is better shown than the research that they've funded that's really been able to help inform the NAAQS, both by design as well as just outcome. So that really brings us to the topic of this last session, and that is how we as a community, many of us have gotten funding from HEI, others from other organizations. Just what can we do as a community to design, conduct, and document studies that best inform the NAAQS reviews? So you can read the title of this session, and that really says it all, I think. And with that, I'd like to introduce my co-chair and the first speaker, Erika Sasser. Erika is the director of the Health and Environmental Impacts Division within the Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards at the US EPA, and she directs programs to assess exposures and risks from criteria and toxic air pollutants and to evaluate the cost benefits and economic impacts of EPA air regulations. With that, Erika.
Thank you, Ted. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you, and I want to echo Ted's thanks to you for sticking around for this session. We are hoping today to provoke a dialogue with the research community, which is of very central importance in everything that we do at EPA. And this group who attends this conference often is the source of research studies that are pivotal in the work that we do, and we value the opportunity to share with you some of the hopes and dreams that we have about what we might gain from studies going forward. So the NAAQS worldwide, the United States National Ambient Air Quality Standards, are seen worldwide as a gold standard of clean air protection. And many other countries have emulated our system in this country, and our system is not perfect. We can talk about some of those challenges and flaws. But I think one of the reasons that they are considered such a fundamental driver of health protection and clean air improvement is because they combine two things. First, they successfully integrate evidence across different lines of inquiry, so that the compilation of science that goes into the NAAQS is central to the structure of the standards. And second of all, they're extremely rigorous, both in terms of how they are structured and in terms of how they are implemented. And that gives the standards in the United States a great deal of power to improve air quality. So today we're going to focus on what goes into the construction of the standards. So we're leaving implementation to the side. And we're going to focus today on the underlying scientific basis as well as the design of the standards themselves. All right, I've been told I pressed the, no. There we go. Wrong button. So first we're going to talk about how evidence is used in different phases of the standard setting process. And then we will identify some features or study attributes that are important to us in translating scientific evidence in scientific research into the standards themselves. And we have invited some key experts to address their experiences in designing specific types of studies to better inform key aspects of the NAAQS decisions. This includes air quality characterization and exposure assessment, epidemiologic studies, and human clinical studies. So Ted and I will each introduce the speakers in turn. And before I get to that, I'd like to provide just a quick overview of a couple points I'd like folks to keep in mind as you hear the next set of presentation. And this has to do with the way the NAAQS are constructed, okay, which I think is, we often assume we understand this, but in fact, it's fairly complicated and it's very important. Okay, first, I want to point out that science is the backbone of the NAAQS, and it's used differently in different phases of the standard setting process. So you're going to see this as you see the talks that are coming in the next segments. First of all, in the integrated science assessment, we're focused on establishing causal relationships. Do we have enough evidence to say with confidence that pollutant X causes effect Y? And we're also looking to characterize particularly sensitive populations and the risks that may be attached to exposure among those populations. This is different than what we do in the risk and exposure assessment, where we're looking much more at the quantitative relationship between exposure and effect, right? So we're not just now looking for a generalized relationship. We're looking for a very specific and quantitative relationship where that we can use predictively, right? If you have a standard at level X, will it limit adverse effects to a certain degree? And if you lower the standard further, will you get additional health protections, right? So now the science is being used differently than in the ISA. And when we get to the policy assessment, again, we're looking at the same studies, but we're looking at them in a slightly different way. We are here really focusing on which studies provide the most information at ambient concentrations that are currently observed near the concentrations allowed by the current standards, and do we continue to see adverse effects at levels below those standards? So we're really looking at a narrow zone of air quality. We're looking at specific exposure conditions in specific locations, and we're trying to figure out, do we need to lower the standards further? Okay, so I think of it to some extent as a funnel, where we start out with a really broad lens in the ISA, and we continue to narrow and extract pieces of information from the studies as we go through this process. You're going to hear more about those phases in a minute. This is a diagram that illustrates the differences. Again, the ISA focuses on causality in at-risk populations, the shape of the CR function, and the policy assessment is really looking more at using that evidence base to predict how different levels of a standard might affect risk distributions and magnitude. Okay. In the end, we bring all of this information together to make a judgment about a precise statistic that will be considered health protective. This statistic is defined as 4 elements. An indicator, what is the pollutant? The averaging time, what is the exposure period over which we are worried about people breathing the pollutant? The level, which is where everyone's mind immediately goes to the level. What is the level of the standard? But it's only one element, right? This is the concentration that you're measuring against. And then there's this mysterious thing called form, which most people skip right over, form. But the form is actually really important because it determines the statistic that we use within the air quality distribution to measure compliance, okay? So if you're talking about a standard that's not to be exceeded ever, that's different than a standard that's based on an annual mean or a 98th percentile, where you may have some exceedances, you may allow some exceedances, but when they happen too often, you're concerned that those short-term exposures, the pattern of short-term exposure may lead to an effect. Okay, so it's these 4 elements together that we are looking for and measuring when we look to see whether an area is in attainment with a standard. And the combined, the highest value in an area is what we call the design value. So the highest monitored value that meets all of these, in terms of indicator, averaging time, level, and form, determines whether the area is in attainment or whether the area has work to do. And so in our minds, as we set the standards, as we think about the evidence, always we are thinking about the application in specific areas and how it relates to the design value in those areas. Let me give you a imperfect conceptual model of this. The design value, if you think about an umbrella and the tip of an umbrella, the design value is the very tippy top, the point. It determines the entire distribution of concentrations throughout the geographic area, but everything else is below that point. That is the single highest measurement. So if you meet the standard, if the design value meets the standard, it means everything else in the area is below that point, more protective than the standard requires, okay? So this is the translation that we are going through as we try to extract information from studies and put it into this context. I have a couple examples. This just further illustrates the point. Let's take SO2, for example. SO2, the pollutant is sulfur. The pollutant is actually oxides of sulfur, but we define the indicator in terms of sulfur dioxide. Averaging time is 1 hour, a level of 75 ppb, and the statistic that we look at is the 99th percentile of 1 hour daily maximum concentrations averaged over 3 years. So we're looking at pretty much peak exposures, but we're giving areas some ability to have a couple of exceedances over time that might be slightly higher than that level, and because we don't want areas to flip in and out of attainment, right? 1 year they might have slightly better air quality, the next year they have worse air quality. We're looking for some sort of stable statistic that still captures peak exposures, right? PM has a totally different construction. We have 2 different standards. They have different averaging times and different forms, looking here to control both long-term and short-term exposures, and we have a combined set of standards to do that. All right, I'm going to keep going in the interest of time. I was asked to make sure to point out where we are in the reviews that are going on right now, so I will do that quickly. We just finished the revisions to the fine particle standard. Those were published in March. And we just proposed secondary standards for NAAQS, PM, ecological effects, so that's from deposition of those pollutants. And the other 3 reviews up here are in earlier phases of the work. We have lead going on. The integrated science assessment was recently finished. We are now working on the policy assessment. We are earlier in the NO2 primary review. So this is oxides of nitrogen, and NO2 is the indicator currently. We are moving towards a first draft ISA, but it will be some months before that comes out. And with ozone, we have just moved from a reconsideration of a decision in 2020 to retain the standards into a whole new review that will look at the evidence comprehensively, and we're at the very early phases of that with a workshop coming up in May to look at the key scientific questions and evidence. Okay, so with that introduction, let me introduce our next 2 speakers. And this is just an outlay of all the speakers that you can expect to see today and the topics they will be covering. But our next speaker is, well, I'm going to introduce both Evan and Lars because their slide decks are integrated here. So I'm just going to introduce them both, and they will come up when they're ready. Evan Coffman is a senior epidemiologist in the Center for Public Health and Environmental Assessment at US EPA in our Office of Research and Development. And he focuses on the evaluation and translation of human health science to support EPA regulatory action as it relates to the NAAQS. Evan has led and contributed to integrated science assessments for a range of pollutants, including lead, particulate matter, and ozone. And then following Evan will be Lars Perlmutt. Lars is a health scientist at EPA's Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards, part of EPA's Office of Air and Radiation. And most recently, he co-led the reconsideration of the NAAQS for PM and has participated in several other NAAQS reviews. He has a PhD in environmental health sciences from NYU. So with that, Evan.
The center one? Or? Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you, Erika. Good afternoon, everyone. My presentation today, we can go to, oh, I guess I'm in control of that, huh? Is on optimizing research to inform the NAAQS with a particular focus on the integrated science assessment. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background and framing on the purpose of the ISA, as well as the evolution of the ISA development process. I'll discuss a recent NASM report on the ISA causality framework, and based on recommendations from that report, some advancements we've made in general in the ISA process, but also with a particular focus on ISA scoping and study quality evaluation, with an eye towards the types of information that's important to us when we evaluate relevance and study quality of the literature. Finally, I'll wrap up by providing an overview of our framework for reaching causality determinations and at-risk conclusions, and then a high-level overview of how researchers can design studies to inform those conclusions. So the ISAs provide a comprehensive evaluation and synthesis of the policy-relevant science on the health and welfare effects of criteria pollutants. In doing so, they serve as the scientific foundation for the NAAQS. There are a number of conclusions throughout the ISAs that inform the exposure and risk assessment, as well as the policy assessment. Sort of key among those conclusions are the causality determinations, which reflect the strength of evidence for causal relationships, and also our conclusions on populations that are potentially at increased risk of air pollutant-related health effects. In both of these cases, we are integrating evidence across disciplines to reach these determinations and conclusions based on established frameworks, and I'll discuss both of those frameworks in a little bit more detail later on in this presentation. The ISAs make a number of other conclusions, key science conclusions, in addition to those causality determinations and at-risk conclusions. Those include things like the shape of the concentration response relationship, as well as timing of effects. The first ISAs were released in 2008, and since that time, the ISA process has evolved considerably. We introduced the causality framework in 2009. That was followed by the at-risk framework in 2013. The process for ISA development was then formalized in a standalone preamble to the ISAs in 2015. Since 2015, we've continued to make incremental advances in the ISA development process. Given the amount of time that's elapsed since we introduced the causality framework, and also with the recognition that there are a number of other frameworks out there for evaluating and synthesizing science to reach causal conclusions on exposures, EPA sponsored a NASM study to evaluate the ISA's causality determination. I'll go over some of the findings from that study on the next slide. I just wanted to point out that based on those recommendations, we've already begun making some refinements to our approach. Those were outlined in a recent integrated review plan for the NO2 primary NAAQS. Based on KSAC feedback of that document, we plan to continue to make refinements with an ultimate goal of updating the standalone preamble. So moving on to the NASM report. The NASM committee reached 7 overall conclusions, 3 of which endorse core aspects of the current framework. And so really supported the ISA's current approach to assessing causality in at-risk populations. They did make a number of other recommendations that really focused on improving the clarity and transparency of the framework, as well as the ISA development process in general. I'm not going to go through all of those recommendations or our responses to each of those recommendations. I just wanted to focus on a few that I'll touch on throughout the presentation. The first being clarifying our approach to study quality evaluation as well as scoping. And the second is describing how heterogeneity in exposure response is considered in our causality determinations. So I'm going to start with some sort of general advancements that we've made in ISA development in response to some of those NASM recommendations. So some of these advancements are in direct response to the report. Others we had sort of had in motion as the NASM study was convened. So on the right side of this slide, you'll see a figure that provides an overview of the steps involved in the ISA development process, starting with defining the scope of the assessment, all the way down to releasing the final ISA. So we've introduced discipline-specific scoping statements, and I'll talk about those on the next slide. We've also implemented more targeted literature searches using things like relational searches, and we've implemented machine learning methods to aid in more efficient screening of the literature. We've also expanded our approach to study quality evaluation to improve clarity. We've begun using evidence maps to inform ISA development, and we've aimed for more transparent documentation of our search results and screening in our health and environmental research online database. So moving on to our scoping statements, as I mentioned in the previous statement, we've begun developing discipline-specific scoping statements for the ISAs. These are becoming more and more common in the systematic review literature. We use these to establish our inclusion and exclusion criteria based on the objectives of our review, and this really facilitates in identifying the most relevant literature for our assessments. Our scoping statements are informed by the body of evidence from previous ISAs, as well as expert knowledge of the scientific literature, both from internal staff and based on feedback that we get from CASAC in reviewing our scoping statements during their review of the integrated review plans. We've also expanded our study quality approach to more clearly articulate the study attributes and approaches that are relevant for assessing the strengths and limitations of individual studies and the strength of inference that can be drawn from those studies. These aspects include things like, for the epidemiologic literature, things like the strength of the study design, the representativeness of a study population and potential for selection bias, strength of exposure surrogates and the potential for exposure misclassification, among other things. On the whole, the studies that minimize potential sources of bias ultimately contribute most to our key conclusions, certainly with the understanding, though, that limitations in one study can be complemented by the strengths of another study and vice versa. So in order to effectively evaluate study relevance and study quality, we really rely on transparent reporting of data, methods, and assumptions of the research community. So we put together this little checklist that just highlights some of the things that are important to us in evaluating the scientific literature. Some of these may seem obvious to all of you, things like where your study was conducted and the years of the study. I would say, though, that over my years of evaluating thousands of studies for the ISAs, you would be surprised how often people forget some of this information in their studies. I wanted to point out a few that are particularly important and sometimes not included when researchers publish papers. The first being exposure distributions. Obviously, it's helpful to know the distributions of exposures across a study population. Exposure assessment techniques and validation metrics help us assess the potential for exposure measurement error. It's important for us not just to see final confounders that were adjusted for either in models or in study design, but also those potential confounders that were considered but not ultimately included in the rationale for that as well. So DAGs are really useful in this regard. And then finally, the ISAs don't rely on statistical significance. We're looking at the pattern of results across studies. And so specific effect estimates and confidence intervals or standard errors are important to us, or more important to us than just a statement that a particular result is not statistically significant. So finally, I just wanted to end by providing an overview of our causality determination framework, as well as our approach to reaching conclusions on at-risk populations. So as I mentioned earlier, NASM endorsed our weight of evidence framework for causality. Each level of the causal hierarchy is delineated by our ability to rule out with reasonable confidence chance, confounding, and other biases. In doing so, we use the Bradford-Hill criteria to aid in our assessment of causality, with a particular focus on consistency of results within a discipline, coherence of results across disciplines, and biological plausibility for observed effects. We also apply a separate framework for at-risk populations. In this case, a four-category hierarchy to convey confidence in the scientific evidence as to whether certain populations or life stages are at increased risk. One of the comments we got on our at-risk conclusions is what role they play in our causality determinations. And so we've provided some clarifying language to make it clear that if we observe an effect in an at-risk population, regardless of whether that health effect is observed in other populations or the population as a whole, those certainly play an important role in reaching a causal relationship, a determination of a causal relationship. So I just wanted to wrap up here with some high-level thoughts on how researchers can design studies to inform these key scientific conclusions. So one way to think about this is whether research could be aimed to address causality determinations or some other key scientific conclusions within the ISAs. So for those health outcomes where the evidence does not support a causal relationship, research that's aimed at addressing those uncertainties that are precluding a stronger causality determination are really impactful. These uncertainties are obviously different across pollutants and exposure durations and outcomes, but some of the common themes we see are things like exposure measurement error, lack of biological plausibility, and potential for co-pollutant confounding. For health outcomes where we have stronger evidence, so these are determinations of likely to be causal or causal, there's still several important science policy questions to address. Again, these differ from ISA to ISA, but include things like effects at low concentrations and the shape of the concentration-response relationship. And of course, research on populations and life stages that are potentially at increased risk is always impactful research. So I just wanted to give a quick plug before I wrap up to say that a lot of these key science policy questions are highlighted in our integrated review plans for the NAAQS reviews. And these questions often carry over from assessment to assessment. And so that's a good resource to understand some of those key science policy questions. The ISAs highlight the particular lines of evidence that contribute to a causality determination, as well as the remaining uncertainties in those lines of evidence. And so, again, that's another great resource. And then as Lars will discuss in just a minute here, the policy assessments include a section on research and data gaps. So again, another great resource for researchers. So with that, thank you for your attention, and I'll turn it over now to Lars.
Alrighty, let's see, I'm getting oriented here. I'm looking everywhere. So, first of all, thank you to HEI for hosting. This has been a wonderful few days, and I've met a lot of people finally in person whose research I have read from afar, and it's been really nice to chat with a lot of people. And so Evan just discussed a lot of work related to the ISA. I am coming from the background in the policy assessment, and so this brief talk is on how the science that all of you are producing is used to inform policy options in EPA's policy assessments. So briefly, the schematic on the right is a very high-level diagram of how we complete NAAQS reviews. And we have a planning phase, an assessment phase, and then, of course, rulemaking phase. So today we're talking mostly in the assessment phase. Of course, Evan just spoke about the scientific assessment phase. I'm going to talk both about the risk and exposure assessment as well as of how those feed in to the policy assessment. And of course, then we move into the rulemaking phase where the administrator makes his judgment on whether or not the standards are adequate with an adequate margin of safety, or whether a alternative standard needs to be undertaken and revised. So in our group, we are creating the policy assessment with the goal of bridging the gap between the scientific, that ISA, and quantitative assessments, and the judgments that the administrator requires in determining, again, whether it's appropriate to retain the NAAQS or potential alternative standards. And as Erika was saying, there are 4 elements of that standard. And so let's keep that in mind. It's not necessarily just the level, but the administrator is making a judgment on each of those 4 elements. So in order to inform the administrator's decisions on the adequacy, the policy assessment is really evaluating the public health protection provided by the current standards, as well as any alternative standards, and he or she is emphasizing the at-risk populations. Using information from the integrated science assessment, the policy assessment is focusing on the health endpoints where there's the strongest support, and so that's the causal determinations, or the likely to be causal determinations. And additionally, the PA is taking information from the integrated science assessment related to those at-risk populations. And so as the PA, again, bridges that gap, it's really looking at that relationship between the causality determinations, which are strongest, and protecting those most at-risk populations. Now, as the PA is completed, it's asking very specific policy-relevant questions, both that are derived from information in the ISA as well as derived from information in risk and exposure assessments. So the policy assessment is evaluating the current scientific information related to the nature of effects from exposure in ambient air, and also the potential for effects to occur under air quality conditions that are both associated with current air quality conditions as well as any alternative levels that may be evaluated. And so what is it that we're asking from the PA of the ISA? Well, again, it comes down to the nature of effects. What are those key health outcomes that we see evidence of? Additionally, from the ISA, we're interested in, what are the exposure durations and concentrations associated with those health effects? And then in the risk and exposure assessment, we're really interested in the extent to the exposure and risk to at-risk populations. And again, we're evaluating areas that are meeting the standard as well as these alternative levels of the standard, if applicable. So in the next couple of slides, very quickly, I'm going to provide some examples of how the policy assessment will use information from specific scientific disciplines with specific air pollutants in order to inform these policy-relevant questions. So this first example is using ozone as an example. And it's using the controlled human exposure studies, the clinical studies in this slide as an example. The figure on the right is showing some of the controlled human exposure studies. This isn't necessarily a comprehensive list, but it's just an example. But it's showing health endpoints and some of the health impacts that we're concerned with, including decrements in lung function and respiratory symptoms. So let's keep in mind those 4 elements of the standard again. Ozone has an 8-hour averaging time, and that form is the tricky part. It's the 4th high 8-hour maximum concentration that's averaged over 3 years. And so our current ozone standard has a level of 70. So we look to the ISA to evaluate what does the evidence show. Again, what are the nature of the effects and what are the duration and concentrations where those effects are seen. When we look at the clinical studies in ozone, we see that 6.6-hour exposures of greater than 60 parts per billion are reporting respiratory effects in healthy exercising adults. And then when we look to the evidence in more shorter exposure periods, 1 to 2 hour exposure periods, in clinical studies where individuals have heavy intermittent or heavy continuous exercise, we're not seeing statistically significant effects until exposures reach 120 or greater parts per billion. Now, these were in healthy populations, but of course the ISA tells us, well, what are your at-risk populations for ozone, which is ultimately what we want to have a standard that protects against. These identified populations are people with asthma, children, older adults, and people who are active outdoors. So the clinical studies mostly were looking at healthy adults. But on the flip side, we want to understand the extent to which at-risk populations, like children, have exposures, and we use health risk and exposure assessments to understand the exposures in this at-risk population of children. So again, coming back to the purpose of the policy assessment, it's to bridge the gap between the assessments, so those scientific assessments, as well as the risk and quantitative assessments, and administrator judgment. So this example is pulled from the 2014 Risk and Exposure Assessment for Ozone, and it's used as an example of how the administrator in 2015 judged the available information in front of her. Now, judgment is informed by science, and that includes, of course, uncertainties and limitations on what ozone exposures should be considered. So in the 2015 decision, ozone was lowered from a standard level of 75 parts per billion to 70 parts per billion. In that decision, the administrator judged that the evidence supporting the occurrence of adverse respiratory effects is strongest to exposures greater than 70 and 80 parts per billion. So that's coming back to the previous slide. The administrator is judging information on the scientific evidence. The administrator also expressed less confidence that the adverse effects will occur following ozone exposures as low as 60 parts per billion. Additionally, the administrator in 2015, she recognized that inter-individual variability in the responsiveness to ozone occurred and focused on setting a standard level that would provide protection against repeated exposures of concern. So when the administrator looked to the health and risk exposure assessment, setting a standard level of 70, in addition to the scientific evidence, the administrator focused on setting that standard level of 70 to eliminate the occurrence of greater than 2 exposures that are greater than 80 parts per billion and virtually eliminate 2 exposures greater than 70 parts per billion, and substantially limit the occurrence of greater than 2 exposures greater than 60 parts per billion to the general public and those at-risk populations. So the point here is that a standard level of 70 doesn't just protect against 70, but it does protect against lower concentrations as well as higher concentrations. So I gave a quick example of the clinical side of the evidence. And these are just examples too, but there are continued research gaps that have persisted in previous reviews and that continue to persist, and I'd like to just quickly run through these. So there continues to be a lack of controlled human exposure studies that are evaluating respiratory effects in at-risk populations at exposures around the current standard of 70. So more controlled human exposure studies would provide more information to evaluate the adequacy of the current standard. Really quickly, I want to just elaborate on this second point too. Epidemiologic studies currently exist where air quality is much greater than 70. And so when we look at epidemiologic studies, we are finding that the metrics that are lined up with the standard can sometimes be different. Sometimes we're getting air quality statistics that are providing a seasonal average, whereas the metrics of the ozone standard aren't quite matched up with a mean. I'll get to a mean in the next slides with PM. And additionally, a lot of the epidemiologic studies occur in areas where the design value, that is that number that we determine compliance, is much, much higher than the current standard of 70. And so it creates a challenge when we see epidemiologic studies at higher concentrations to evaluate whether or not 70 is currently adequate. And I won't go through the rest. I hope you'll have access to these slides, but there are numerous other examples. And I will, as Evan said, put a plug in for the ozone policy assessment that also further details some of these research needs and these research gaps. And then moving forward to particulate matter. Particulate matter is very focused on the epidemiologic evidence. And the figure you see here is just one example of the numerous number of PM studies that were available to us in this 2024 review. A lot of these studies, even on this figure, were funded by HEI. And so, you as a scientific community play a very important role, and we're very, very thankful for that. So in the 2024 review, the unbelievable amount of scientific evidence that we pull from the ISA tells us the nature of effects. Again, coming back to those policy relevant questions. The ISA finds positive and significant associations with a lot of studies between PM 2.5 exposures and mortality and morbidity. The ISA also, lets us know what those causality determinations are. And so PM and exposure to PM causes mortality, causes cardiovascular effects, is likely to cause respiratory effects, cancer, and nervous system effects. And of course, we are very interested in the at-risk populations that are identified in the ISA. For particulate matter, the at-risk populations identified include children, older adults, people with pre-existing heart and lung disease, minority populations, and low SES populations. So it's very clear from the ISA that EPI plays a very strong role in the review of the PM NAAQS. I don't have a pointer, so I will quickly go through this figure. This is an example of some of the information from the epidemiologic studies that we evaluate in the policy assessment. And the solid circles are mean reported PM 2.5 concentrations for monitored studies. I'll get in the next slide, I'll talk about a bit about the exposure assessment methods, but these are only monitored studies. You'll see a very limited number of studies, 3 studies that report some of these lower concentration percentiles, the 25th percentiles and the 10th percentiles. And this is one of those areas where we think are pretty low-hanging fruit. This goes to what Evan was saying, more reporting of descriptive statistics, both around the air quality distribution as well as the health events associated with those air quality statistics would be really useful to help evaluate. So with epidemiology, of course, we see associations across the full air quality distribution. In other words, there's no bright line in that distribution where above which we continue to see effects and below which we stop seeing effects. And so when the administrator must make the judgment and the PA in bridging that gap between the scientific assessments as well as the quantitative assessments, again, he has to look at these means and the epidemiology data and make judgments. There is confidence. He judges confidence is highest in the reported association around the mean of the epidemiologic study, and that he has diminished confidence as those concentration percentiles start to decrease. And so in the 2024 rule, the administrator did place some weight on the 25th percentile, but again was most confident in those mean reported concentrations. And so the previous slide gave an example of the monitored studies, but one of the wonderful advancements in this review has been the introduction of these more hybrid modeling approaches that have a lot of benefits. They expand the number of people that can be included in a study. They can occur in areas of the country where perhaps we don't have a monitor. And so this was an advancement of this 2024 review. Now, in looking at these studies, though, the PA also recognized that it's important to understand what does a mean actually represent in a hybrid modeling study versus what does a mean represent in a monitored study. The diagram in the table on our right is a very simplistic figure that looks at 1 by 1 kilometer grid cells of PM2.5 concentrations, but the dots represent monitored 3-year averages, design value concentrations in the Atlanta CBSA area. And so what this simplistic figure allows us to do is not only look at, hey, the highest monitor in an area would be the design value monitor. Where are we evaluating whether or not the standard is being met? And I can't quite see it because my eyes are getting bad, but I think the design value monitor is about 10.6. But what this figure also enables us to do is if we were only to look at the monitors and think about that in the context of an epidemiologic study that's only using monitors, we see that the concentration around that design value area has a distribution. It's lower than the design value. And then when you look at the hybrid modeling, those 1 by 1 kilometer grid cells, you're starting to get lower concentrations. Now, what we found in the PM review was sometimes studies were very descriptive on whether or not they were population weighting those hybrid modeling studies. Other times we really struggle to understand how the mean of the study was actually calculated and whether or not, some of these grid cells were used that didn't even have health events. And so the point here is twofold. Again, more information is really, really helpful in how exposures are being estimated and then how those means are being calculated. Another really important point here, though, is that when an area is expected to meet a design value, as Erika alluded to, that's going to be the highest concentration in the area. And by setting a standard focused on the mean of an epidemiologic study where there's a lot of confidence in the association of a health effect, we're setting a standard, in this case, at 9, and you're going to expect an area to meet 9 and then have this larger and lower distribution in that area. So you're protecting against 9 and lower concentrations. So I've alluded to these information needs already, but it's really, really helpful to understand, again, how are exposures being estimated and what does the context of those exposures mean when a mean concentration is reported. Now, additionally, in that context, descriptive statistics could be very useful, again, in evaluating the standard. As the figure with the mean showed, we only had 3 monitored studies that showed those lower percentile concentrations. And so anything you, as a study author, can report either in the manuscript itself related to air quality descriptive statistics or in supplemental information. And that, is not only the PM2.5 concentrations, but also health events associated with those health concentrations. And lastly, just really quickly, I'll close with a couple of research needs. We're interested in distinguishing between the health impacts of short-term exposures to these, peak concentrations and repeated concentrations versus long-term exposures to those more typical daily exposures. One of the other research needs that we've found would be helpful is experimental studies that could further inform biological plausibility at more of these lower concentrations that we're seeing effects in epi studies. And finally, just continued research on how effects might vary across different populations, and maybe that's one of the at-risk populations like children or minority populations. So I'd just like to close with a big thank you. This scientific community is extraordinarily crucial to our work, and the type of PM review that we just completed isn't possible without HEI and without the work that all of you are doing, so thank you. I'll put in one more plug for our policy assessments. They really do detail a lot of what we believe were some of our uncertainties in the judgments being formulated in those policy assessments and some of the future research directions. And lastly, by all means, please feel free to email myself and my EPA colleagues. We're here to try and help you help us. Thank you.
Thank you, Lars. Our next speaker is Joshua Apte, and Josh is an associate professor of environmental engineering and environmental health sciences at UC Berkeley, where his research focuses on developing new methods for quantifying air pollution exposures to inform policies related to health, climate, and inequity. So his group uses field experiments, air quality models, satellites, as we just heard about, remote sensing to quantify emissions and concentrations and their resulting spatial patterns, human exposures, and health consequences. It scales from city blocks to the global level. So with that, there you are.
Thanks, Ted. And big thanks to HEI and EPA for putting this together. Let's see if I can make this work. There we go. There's an interesting chicken and egg aspect about how exposure assessment plays a role in air pollution policy. The pollutants we understand best, I think, are the pollutants that we regulate, because those are the ones that we then have to monitor, and it's very easy to do epi on pollutants for which we have lots of monitoring data. Many of those pollutants also tend not to vary that sharply in space, like PM2.5 and ozone, which means that you don't need that many monitors to actually learn something for 330 plus million people. But of course, if you don't have that monitoring data, it can be very hard to do an epi study or another type of assessment of health impacts. And so I think one of the reasons that we don't see new standards for pollutants of health concern very quickly is that it can be very hard to get that kind of exposure information. So I want to use that to sort of motivate what are some of the things we think about in exposure assessment and how those impact air pollution policy, including setting the NAAQS. So certainly we do exposure science and exposure assessment for its application to epidemiology and ultimately how that can feed into standards. But I think that there are three other good reasons as well to do these type of exposure studies. One is to really understand mechanistically the processes that drive our exposures. And we do that because when you have a better understanding of the processes that drive exposures, you can intervene along multiple parts in the causal pathway that affects ultimately our health. So obviously controlling emissions is one way, but there are other ways too. I think a third and increasingly salient reason for doing this type of exposure assessment is to better understand disparities and inequities and how we might address those. So there's the why, but there's also the who, the when, and the where. And I think one of the things that you've maybe gotten a sense of from the previous presentations already is that there are so many different ways to quantify exposure and so many different aspects to quantify that I think it could be kind of hard to digest that into a single set of usable metrics for standards. And so here you can just sort of get a sense from the slide, I won't read all these aspects off, of all the different ways that exposures can be quantified. And some of these aspects are more or less necessary depending on the context. So in my own work, I focus a lot at the urban scale. And at the urban scale, there are, I think, some real analytical challenges of trying to better understand human exposure. One of the first challenges is that doing regulatory monitoring is quite expensive. It's challenging. And we don't have that many regulatory monitors in a city. So to give you a sense of what that regulatory monitoring looks like, for every 1 million people in a big American city, you might have 1, 2, 3 monitors at best. And yet there are sharp gradients in exposure, as we all know, near our sources, especially for the primary pollutants. And those gradients emerge not only because, of course, sources are unevenly distributed, but people are too. And exposure happens when you have people near those sources. Disparities happen when you have segregated societies near those sources. And if we don't have enough resolution in our ability to assess that, then we can't capture those disparities. And finally, the causal chain is complex between emissions, exposures, and our health effects. And we may want to capture multiple aspects of that causal chain in order to better understand where we can intervene. We can capture exposures at a wide range of different spatial scales and temporal scales. I think you've already seen how some of the most powerful studies in setting the new NAAQS, say for PM, have been done at the national scale because we can get really big populations at very low levels of exposure and start to see even very subtle health effects that at scale are a really big deal. But of course, there are lots of exposure measurements that happen at the ambient scale, say by our regulatory monitoring, which is important not just for assessing exposure, but also compliance with the standard. And then there are even finer intra-urban scales, which can be very powerful for epidemiology and also for understanding disparities. On the temporal sense, there's lots of different ways that temporally we can quantify exposure. I think we've already heard about this in the past talks about the number of different ways that one can express an averaging time. Some standards are done at the hourly scale. We, of course, spend a lot of time thinking about annual average exposures for many pollutants because we know that the health effects from chronic long-term exposure can be often very large compared to the short-term exposure variation depending on the pollutant. And I think increasingly there's the capability to think about life course exposures as we think about, sort of long-term birth cohorts that have been done with sophisticated epidemiology over time. And they too may reveal important things that are not going to be possible to capture all the time, but give an important lens. So when you think about some of the aspects that we have to capture when we do exposure assessment, it's worth thinking a little bit first about sort of what drives this process. So of course, we have sources, those are the emissions. The sources are diluted by meteorological factors, so wind and vertical dispersion. And then there's chemical transformation in many pollutants to produce secondary pollutants. And then we have people moving around in this spatiotemporally varying field. And it doesn't vary just in space and time, it also varies in this third axis of chemical composition. And one of the crucial aspects about these 3 ways that you can think about a system that we're exposed to, time, space, and composition, is that very few methods can capture all 3 of these aspects simultaneously. So to give you one trivial example, we can make regulatory measurements of many pollutants, so we have a good idea about the chemical composition of the urban atmosphere. We can do this with good temporal resolution, so we can see how it varies hour by hour, and the long-term trends getting better and better, hopefully. But the spatial resolution for those regulatory networks tends to be sparse. Other approaches, like some of the hyperlocal urban monitoring approaches, can capture the spatial variation really well, maybe even for many pollutants, but the temporal resolution tends to not be so good for some of these hyperlocal measures. So that gives you a sense of sort of the different aspects that you can quantify. And in the past 15 years, if you've been following the research at all, you know how many new measurement strategies have sort of exploded onto the scene as a way of being able to better quantify exposure. So I wanted to just talk about some of the highlights here and some of the relative strengths of different approaches. Low-cost sensor networks are not just valuable because they're lower cost, they're also valuable because you can make large crowdsourced data sets of observation and get a quite decent spatial resolution, sometimes for some pollutants like PM2.5 actually with really pretty good precision now. The low-cost sensors for PM are not bad anymore. And you can capture exposures in places where you might never have regulatory monitors. So for instance, for wildfire smoke exposure, I think the low-cost sensors for PM2.5 have made a huge impact. However, low-cost sensors often are not great for every pollutant. You can't get as much chemical resolution for many of these things. In contrast, mobile monitoring can get even finer spatial resolution down to the sub-city block scale, and you can really see persistent enhancements in hotspots that might sometimes be quite important for disparities or for identifying sources you didn't know about, often with a lot of chemical resolution, but the temporal resolution in mobile monitoring is not good. You can only at best get sort of a long-term average from lots of repeated observations. Then at the personal scale, personal measurements, I think, are really valuable when you think about where most exposure happens, which is indoors. We spend most of our time indoors, and if we want to truly mitigate exposures, the indoor environment is important, even if it's not directly addressed by our standards. And the personal measurement technologies have gotten far better. And finally, satellite remote sensing is at the opposite end of the spatial spectrum, really powerful for getting national scale or continent scale exposures with actually decent spatial precision for many pollutants. And just looking around the room, I just see so many faces of friends here who are really the leading experts at each of these techniques. And so I think it's just sort of a testament to how much better we've gotten at doing this over the past few decades. In terms of modeling is also really important in terms of these sort of large health studies that can help us understand the health effects of air pollution. So what some folks earlier were talking about as hybrid models are sometimes called empirical models. These models often try to use a limited set of observations and then much less expensive predictors to predict what exposures are everywhere. They can get really broad spatial extent, so you can do an entire continent. There are actually some global land use regression models as well. But down even at this within urban scale that get decently high spatial resolution, so you can capture localized hotspots. These models are really helpful for epi. However, because they're not designed to be explanatory or causal, they're not very helpful for telling you about what you could do in the future by reducing your emissions. So they're not good for what-if scenarios. In contrast, we know that physics-based models like chemical transport models like WRF-Chem or CMAQ are great for those kind of things, but they're very computationally expensive. And so a second sort of class of models has also emerged called reduced complexity models. These are emulators of these physics-based models, and so they can simulate alternative realities. You can look at what-if scenarios to think about how you might mitigate exposures for populations that might be disparately exposed. They can't capture the finest scale spatial features, and of course, if your emissions inventories are wrong, these models will also be wrong, but they're very helpful for thinking about interventions. And then finally, I think data fusion is playing an increasingly big role in our exposure assessment landscape. Actually, strictly speaking, almost all satellite remote sensing products are data fusion products because the satellite sees the column, but we're breathing down at the ground level. And so there's always some modeling that's done to make sense of the satellite observational constraint. Many of the hybrid air pollution models now are using really novel predictor variables. Like we have street level imagery from Google Street View cameras and other things for almost the entire world now. And we can use those as predictors of the spatial variation of our observations. And then finally, with many of these new observational approaches sort of really taking off, we can do data fusion to combine these different observational approaches in clever ways. Ultimately, though, you have to match the scale of your analysis with the research question you're interested in. So satellites and these empirical models are really good at the national scale. At the within urban scale, you often might want an in situ observation like a low-cost sensor network or mobile monitoring. And then if you want to study personal exposures, you either have to do personal monitoring or indoor microenvironmental monitoring to capture sort of people's real-world lived experience of exposure. So because the focus of this session is on the NAAQS, I wanted to walk through a thought exercise for a second and explore, well, where is the new PM2.5 NAAQS of 9 micrograms per cubic meter going to take us in terms of how we quantify people's exposures and whether we're going to be able to do this fully right. And here the big challenge is that our modern network for PM2.5 is still somewhat sparse, right? So even if you pick the metropolitan statistical areas that make our country cities up, these are cities of more than 50K. The median MSA in the US has 1 monitor. If you population weight that to account for the bigger cities, then we've got about 5 monitors per MSA. But for big cities, 5 monitors is not enough to really capture the full spatial variation. So let's walk through a thought experiment for a second and ask ourselves, well, what if we used a national hybrid model? This is the cases land use regression model I'm showing you here as one of these national hybrid models to try to simulate what what exposures would be if that's how we assess the NAAQS as opposed to based on regulatory monitoring. So these are the areas that for 2019 exceeded the 9 microgram per cubic meter NAAQS that had at least one census tract with more than 9 micrograms per cubic meter in them. Much of this map looks familiar, but there are some places that might not show up on sort of a traditional EPA map based on other monitoring approaches. And actually, there's some good news about, I think, the way that the 9 micrograms per cubic meter NAAQS was set if you care about disparities. So if you look at all the census tracts in the country where a national model says that we have more than 9 micrograms per cubic meter annual average PM2.5, there's about 50 million people who live there, and that population has actually a substantially higher share of Black, Hispanic, and Asian people compared to the nation as a whole. And so if you care about reducing the exposure disparities in our country, attaining the 9 microgram per cubic meter max, I think would make a big difference in terms of addressing some of the disparities that many of us care about. However, our monitoring may not capture all of those areas. So I'm just highlighting 2 urban areas here, showing you the simulated PM2.5 annual average concentrations from this empirical model, census tract by census tract, and then highlighting the locations of the 2 regulatory monitors in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and in Orlando, Florida. And what's showing up in these two cities is that the monitors are in places below 9 micrograms per cubic meter, but there are plenty of census tracts that exceed those locations. And so these are places that would be non-detected potentially by a monitor network if this represents the true spatial variation of air pollution. And I think one could and should question whether any model is correct, and I don't think it's appropriate to use a monitor for regulatory determinations, but this sort of is a useful thought exercise. So overall, there are dozens of these urban areas around the country that either have no monitoring whatsoever, those are the red ones, or that have the highest monitored tract falling below the standard, but they have plenty of tracts that are above the standard, and that might mean that we're missing some places. And so this poses some interesting challenges for how we think about the monitoring infrastructure of the future, especially as we go to cleaner and cleaner NAAQSs in the future. And I'm sure we won't stop at 9. The levels may fall in the future, and eventually we're going to get to urban areas that don't have a ton of monitoring, and that may be, I think, quite a challenge for thinking about how we monitor in the future. So even at 9, about 70% of the urban areas and about 40% of the population of those urban areas that have some census tracts above 9 would not necessarily be captured by just the monitoring we have in place today. So, where do we think about exposure assessment going forward? I think that's kind of where I'd like to close. Measurements, I think, are really in some ways philosophically and legally the most defensible way to characterize exposure because you actually are going and measuring a real thing. And when we think about accountability or studying long-term trends, having this detailed observational record of how things are getting better and better is really helpful. And I'm super glad we have a regulatory network because it shows how much progress we've really made with real measurements you can trust. But going and making supplemental measurements that challenge our understanding and teach us things that we didn't know to expect is really powerful. And I loved the aviation talk this morning as a great example of this. I remember when Neil actually first went and made measurements of ultrafine particles in LA, I don't think she was expecting to see that plume from LAX, but she saw it, and now we know that this is actually a big source across the country because we knew that we could start finding this pattern once we did some measurements. So this is why you need to be able to, especially when you have pollutants of emerging interest, to go get yourself surprised, and that's why measurements are really valuable. But models are essential too. Models and remote sensing are both really highly scalable approaches. You can go nationwide. You can study really big populations. That's really powerful for our epidemiology. And it allows us to also consider things often at multiple ranges of spatial scales, which is powerful. The cost effectiveness of it is indisputable, and I think that's an essential aspect. And finally, as we think about how we want to reach these ever lower levels and how we want to mitigate disparities, we need mechanistic models that are widely usable. And so reduced complexity models, I think, have a big role to play as well. I've really appreciated the EPA perspective here on, as an exposure scientist, how to make my information and measurements sort of more usable for the science policy process. So I just really want to amplify what Erika and Lars and Evan said, that standards are described in terms of very precise metrics, and reporting precisely what you saw across a whole distribution can be really valuable. Just to close with some summary thoughts, I think the traditional ambient monitoring is truly essential, and we have to continue doing it. But the emerging methods, especially the hyperlocal monitoring in cities, for instance, can provide a lot of valuable detail and context about places where We have sort of enhanced hotspots that we could potentially control. And then the models are so essential for scalability. I'll close with what I think are 3 emerging needs. First, there's so many resources being poured into additional community monitoring right now by the EPA. And it's awesome. I mean, I'm not sure the total number, but it may be in excess of $1 billion now from IRA that's going to states and communities to support enhanced monitoring. I'd love to see more and more of that data being reported in a systematic way where we actually can use it for health studies, where we can use it for exposure analysis and so on. But we have a methods challenge here, which is that I don't think we figured out all the data analysis techniques to put this together into sort of a systematic, well-assimilated data product that we can all use. It's a really interesting stats problem, and I hope that we can find some new scientific collaborations to solve that challenge. And then I know that HEI has an EJ research program. There's a big accountability theme in that. So if we are spending so much money trying to address the disparities in our country, we really ought to be able to track the progress for that. And so having a systematic observational approach for seeing whether the emissions reductions we're doing for climate and for environmental justice are really making a difference ought to make sense. And so I think there's a real opportunity for exposure assessment to contribute there, as it does contribute to the NAAQS. So I'll stop here, and I'm happy to answer questions after.
Thank you, Josh. And I just want to say how exciting it is to us to see the energy, the enthusiasm, and the forward thinking that's going on within the research community about how your work can better inform decision making. It's just amazing, the advances we've made already and where we're headed. Our next speaker is Rachel Nethery, and I'd like to introduce Rachel. She is an assistant professor of biostatistics at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Her research is focused on the development of statistical methods that enable rigorous and impactful analyses of environmental health data and thereby inform evidence-based environmental policy and clinical guidelines to protect health, often using Medicare data, which I believe she's going to talk about today. And she is the most recent recipient of the Walter A. Rosenblith Award from HEI for early career investigators. So join me in welcoming Rachel.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Thanks to HEI for hosting an incredible conference. Thanks to you guys for staying until the very last speaker here. So I'm very lucky to work in a group that calls itself the National Studies of Air Pollution and Health Group at Harvard that was largely spearheaded by Francesca Dominici, Joel Schwartz, and Antonella Zanabetti before my time. But this group in general does a lot of air pollution epi studies using Medicare data. So for those who may not be familiar, Medicare is the federal health insurance program available to all Americans age 65 plus. And in fact, I believe at last count, about 96% of Americans age 65 plus are enrolled in Medicare. And Medicare claims data are made available to researchers for particular projects through the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So we're lucky in our group to have about 20 years of Medicare claims data that we use for air pollution epi studies. And we know that some of these studies have been pretty influential in recent EPA policy decisions. So today I'm going to talk to you about 3 particular studies that we know have been pretty influential. And then I'm going to talk more generally about some of the advantages and challenges of working with Medicare data for policy relevant research. A disclaimer first is that I'm going to be talking about my lab's work more generally. I wasn't actually involved in each of the studies that I'm going to highlight today, and the views that I express in my interpretations here are my own. So I'm going to highlight again 3 studies that have specifically looked at the associations between PM2.5 and mortality that we know were influential in the most recent decision to modify the NAAQS. These studies, I should mention, were I believe all funded at least in part by HEI, so we've been very lucky to have HEI funding throughout the years for our group. The first one that I'm going to highlight is the New England Journal of Medicine study from 2017 that I believe used about 13 years of Medicare claims data. And using those, they formed this open cohort of Medicare enrollees. So basically, people were sort of entered into the study from the later of the start of data availability, or when they entered Medicare, and then followed until either they died or the end of data availability, or in very rare cases, people may drop out of this cohort, but I'll talk later about why that's a pretty rare occurrence. So this open cohort had about 60 million Medicare enrollees, about 60 million folks age 65 plus in the US. They were really geographically dispersed and roughly representative of the geographic distribution of the US population as a whole. In total, about 460 million person years of follow-up in this data set. How do we determine PM2.5 exposures for all these folks? So we link to PM2.5 exposure information from one of these hybrid models that have been discussed in several of the previous talks. So we have a hybrid model of PM2.5 predicting PM2.5 concentrations at high spatial resolution across the US. For Medicare beneficiaries, we observe their zip code of residence, and so we basically aggregate those predictions in ways that I'll talk a little bit about later from the hybrid model to the zip code level, and then link individuals to their exposure, the exposure in their zip code of residence. So analytically, the models used in this paper were pretty simple. They used a Cox model adjusted for a variety of individual and neighborhood level covariates. And they found what lots of studies have found before, a strong positive association between annual average PM2.5 and mortality, about a 7% increase in risk of mortality, I believe, per 10 microgram per cubic meter increase in PM. This study was also valuable because it looked at associations stratified by race, sex, and Medicaid eligibility subgroups. So Medicaid eligibility is effectively a proxy for low income status in the Medicare data, because Medicaid is a health insurance program that's only available to low income individuals. So this study, by looking at those subgroup specific associations, provided some of the strongest evidence, at least up to that time, for disproportionate health burdens borne by certain marginalized groups in the US, including low-income individuals, Black individuals, Hispanic individuals. The second study that I'm going to talk about was sort of like a follow-on to that first study, used all the same data as the first study and added on 4 more years of follow-up data. Another one of the major advancements from this study was that it used causal inference methodology to look at the association between PM2.5 and mortality to sort of increasingly, hopefully, increase our chances of sort of incurring bias due to the observational study design that's required in this context. Another contribution of this work sort of speaks back to what some of our EPA colleagues talked about earlier, looking at particularly effects of PM2.5 below the then current NAAQS of 12 micrograms per cubic meter. So that was another focus of this paper in an effort to guide policy. And so what they largely found was that the results from the previous study, which were obtained using sort of standard regression methods, were not really sensitive to the switch to causal methods. So we saw pretty much this almost identical effect estimates when using sort of the standard regression versus causal inference techniques. Still strong positive associations. And interestingly, we found that at levels below the then current NAAQS of 12, we actually saw like stronger effects of PM below that threshold, meaning that a change in PM was actually associated with a stronger change in risk of mortality at levels below the then current NAAQS compared to above. And finally, one last study I'll highlight, in which I think this was just published last year when the EPA announced that they were considering revising the NAAQS. We released this study to try to better characterize inequities in air pollution-related health burdens, particularly for the first time looking at inequities at the intersection of race and social class. We also specifically in this paper singled out sort of the potential benefits of various possible new NAAQS levels for each of the different race and class subgroups. And so basically what we found is that white low-income individuals, black low-income individuals, and black high-income individuals all experience sort of similar levels of susceptibility to PM2.5 mortality risks, while white high-income individuals experience lower susceptibility. And so then accordingly, that suggests that basically further lowering the NAAQS has more and more sort of differential benefit for these groups that are more susceptible. So now transitioning to kind of the pros and cons of Medicare. Why have we focused on Medicare data? What about these data sort of make them particularly policy relevant in the air pollution epidemiology space? So we can let EPA folks speak to this later, but at least our thoughts on it are that the three main characteristics that make them super policy relevant are that they're representative of an important population, they're extremely diverse, and the data structure allows for sort of principled, what I'll call principled study designs from a statistical perspective. So first, Medicare participants are, again, age 65 plus, and they're representative of that population. So they almost completely capture mortality in the age 65 plus population in the US. Age 65 plus population is a key vulnerable population that's singled out in the Clean Air Act, and that the NAAQS is specifically expected to protect. As others have talked about the kind of importance of representing like low levels of exposure, this is another aspect in which the Medicare data are extremely helpful because they're representative of literally all parts of the US. People in the Medicare population live all across the US, so they're then representative of the exposures experienced basically throughout the entire US. This has provided us with data to inform estimates of health effects both above and below current NAAQS. Also, because they're so geographically diverse, they can provide information into possible differential health effects over space, which might occur due to different sources, different levels of susceptibility, different meteorology, things like that. Compared to your standard sort of prospective cohort study, Medicare data are also helpful because they're extremely diverse. So they provide nearly complete mortality data, even on marginalized groups that are often missed in standard sort of prospective cohorts, including low-income and black individuals. So these individuals have typically been underrepresented in standard cohort studies, which has led to it sort of being difficult to characterize their susceptibility to air pollution health impacts. So Medicare gives us a better glimpse of these important and in many cases highly susceptible populations. I'm a statistician, so I also care that Medicare data allow for kind of principled epi study designs. You've already noticed there's a huge sample size, anywhere between 60 and 80 million people in most of our group studies. However, lots of health claims data these days have sample sizes equally large. So there are other data sets that we could use with equally large sample sizes. So why do we prefer Medicare? So a couple of reasons. Unlike other health claims data, they represent this well-defined population. We know they're representative of the age 65 plus population and capture actually almost the entire population. This, in addition to being satisfying from a substantive perspective, also from a statistical perspective, gives us accurate population denominators with which to estimate rates of mortality and things like that. Moreover, unlike other, at least most of the other like private health claims data that I'm aware of, in Medicare, almost everybody is followed continuously over time from the time they enroll in Medicare until they die. Very few people drop out of Medicare. So there's little of this, what's known as the churning phenomenon in other health claims data, where people exit and then re-enter frequently. And so, for instance, we also own Medicaid data, which is the joint federal and state health insurance program. for low-income individuals in the US. And the problem with these data that's been well noted, and the reason why I think they haven't contributed as much to policy in the air pollution space, is because of this issue of churn of the population. People are constantly coming and going from the Medicaid population, whereas things tend to stay pretty constant in Medicare. There are still quite a few challenges that we're grappling with in Medicare studies, even after like 20 years of using Medicare data for air pollution epidemiology. The key ones have persisted over time, and we still don't have a perfect answer, but we have a lot of partial solutions that we've been using, and very open to suggestion on how we might improve. So the main challenges, at least that I see, are the potential for confounding, which affects almost all air pollution epi studies, the potential for measurement error, particularly in exposure, and the challenges related to data security and computation in these large data. So like all observational studies, almost all air pollution epi studies, of course, there's a potential for unmeasured confounding in our epi studies. This problem is particularly severe in our minds in the Medicare data because we have very few measured individual level characteristics. So I believe the only characteristics that we have at the individual level are race, age, sex, and Medicaid eligibility, as well as, of course, once we start following people, we have information on their health history. But we don't know things like income, education level, health behaviors, things like that at the individual level. You can imagine that many of these factors are probably associated with air pollution exposure and with health outcomes independent of air pollution exposure. And so if we sort of fail to account for them, we might incur some bias in our estimates of the health impacts of air pollution. So we've been thinking about this issue for years, dedicated a ton of our group's work to trying to figure out the best ways to address this with the Medicare data. One thing that we always do, and that's pretty simple, is we always link to area level measures of all these features, which seem to be actually a pretty reasonable proxy of individual level values, particularly if you go down to small spatial resolution in your area level measures. So we always link to and adjust for area level measures of these possible confounders. We also spend a ton of time and effort developing causal inference methods to hopefully more robustly adjust for measured confounders, and in some certain causal inference designs, we can also get some guarantees about adjustment for unmeasured confounders. So we spend a lot of time developing methods. We can also use what are known as causal sensitivity analyses, where we basically look to see how large, how plausible it is that there could be an unmeasured confounder that that could attenuate our effects that we see. And that's using methods like E-values from the epidemiology literature. Also, for a small subset of the Medicare participants, we actually have survey data on them that can be linked to the health claims data, where they've measured these individual level features on income, education, health behaviors, and things like that. And so that for that small sample, we can actually do an analysis adjusting for those features and confirm that our associations are robust. And almost always they are robust to these concerns, but it's something we still spend a ton of time thinking about. Again, like almost all air pollution epi studies, there's the potential for measurement error, particularly in exposure. So again, we rely on the exposure predictions from a hybrid model, which we then aggregate to zip code to link with the Medicare recipients. We typically aggregate just by averaging the PM2.5 concentrations across grid cells within a zip code, although in certain studies we have done more advanced things than that. So we have also spent a lot of time trying to make sure that our results are robust to any potential measurement error, which of course could come from the error in the predictions originally, or the error due to aggregation, or the fact that people don't only stay in their zip code of residence, they move around, and we entirely miss that when we just link to their residential exposures. So we've conducted sensitivity analyses of various types, particularly focusing on people who live near monitors, so we know that we capture their exposure well. and restricting analyses just to those folks, we tend to see robust results, similar measures of association to what we see in the models using the hybrid exposures. We've also developed causal inference methods that try to correct for exposure measurement error in these models, and again, consistently found a ton of robustness to any measurement error problems. We also know that Medicare data, this is a well-documented issue, that Medicare has poor ability to classify Hispanic and Asian individuals, and so that's continuing to make it difficult for us to get solid, reliable characterization of potential inequities experienced by these groups. So I mentioned at the beginning that CMS makes Medicare data, in theory, available to researchers anywhere for any research project. There are a number of practical barriers that I suspect have contributed to these data not being sort of more widely used in the air pollution epi context. First, they're highly sensitive data. So in order to store and analyze the data, you need to use what's called a FSMA-compliant system. You can either create your own system locally that meets certain criteria, or you can use a system that's actually provided by the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Whichever way you go, it's extremely costly to get access to this type of system. So just for being able to download and store the data, there's a pretty huge cost. And then doing any kind of computation on 80 million individuals, 460 million person years of follow-up is a bear. So particularly running the causal models that our group tends to use on this full data can require like well over 500 gigabytes of memory for many, many days to weeks to run these types of models on the full data. It's an open question of how to best handle these issues. Currently, we probably don't do it in the most efficient way. We hire a ton of staff to help with data processing, data security, and code scalability. But of course, these resources aren't accessible to everyone. So, still a problem that I'm happy to discuss more in the panel. I think I'm almost out of time, so I'm not going to talk in detail about our aspirations for ways that we might use Medicare data in the future, but there's still a lot of potential that they hold that's kind of untapped. And would like to thank my research team, National Studies on Air Pollution and Health Group at Harvard. Again, we've been super lucky over the years to have funding from HEI as well as NIH to support this work, and thankful to the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services for their fantastic data resources. I will wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. And I'm going to try to be very brief in terms of where did it go? Come on. Is that going to move us forward? I must have hit something wrong. There we go. So just what I was asked to do is sort of, looking at all the great things that we just heard about. So, we've had a lot of successes in the work that we've done to support the NAAQS. And I just sort of look at and list some of them there. We heard about exposure estimation, doing low-level exposures. These have been tremendous successes that we're now bringing to bear, that we can get these exposure fields. We have the data, the new cohorts, et cetera. I do have one thing that I put out in sort of bold letters, and something that I think we can do as a community is put this information out more available to the community. That is being done, and I think that's great. And there's some things that we didn't hear about today in terms of characterizing exposures, maybe going at the molecular level. How will that be able to help us? And we did hear about the growth of causal modeling methods and how that's informing the NAAQS. Just with that, I think I just want to put out there's some real opportunities ahead that I see. And and just letting this community know it. I think you probably, well, we talked about the satellites, but there's some that are about to go up or have recently got up that I think are just going to be game changers. I'll talk about one of those in a second, tempo. Then there's measurements. There, as Josh talked about, we're getting better and better measurements, more in different types of measurements. These low-cost monitors are getting out there. They're ever more ubiquitous and ever more precise and accurate. And then, you know, we have this whole thing about big data that's coming along. So this is a really exciting time. And really, I put at one of the tops of this list is this tempo mission that is now up. It's now giving us data on a variety of different pollutants at you know, essentially continuous in time and space with a much finer spatial resolution, which has always been sort of one of the Achilles heels, is that it was never fine enough to really look at the detailed spatial gradients. Now we're able to get that. Maybe not yet as at the micro scale, but we're getting there. So that's, I think, just something that's coming. This next one is just, in some ways, a self-plug, but to let this community know is that NSF is actually supporting a network of monitors across the U.S. that are, I think, going to be able to help in our characterizing exposures. It's about 12 sites, most of the major, about 4 of the major urban areas, as well as some more rural areas, and we're getting additional information that just has not been routinely available in the past. So that's going to be out there and coming. So if you're doing exposure modeling, you can start looking to have an additional set of information available. So, but there's some real challenges ahead. As Erika, Lars, and Evan discussed, the standard is made up of 4 different components, and you need the information for each of them. And one of the questions becomes, and I think actually this has come up in multiple sessions, is ultrafines. Where do we get the information for that? And maybe also looking at other components, and why and how are they needed, how are they going to be used, looking at averaging time, et cetera. These are questions that have come up when I've talked to people about this session, what we might talk about. So there are a number of challenges that we're looking at, but I think there's a great community that is going to take those on. So with that, what I wanted to do is bring the panel up here, and the panel is comprised of the speakers and one other person. And as the panel's coming up, I'll just introduce Howard Kipen. Howard is a professor of public health and the director of the Clinical Research in Occupational Medicine at the Rutgers Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences Institute. He has conducted controlled chamber and field studies of mechanisms and biomarkers of toxicity for pollutants including diesel exhaust, ozone, VOCs, and secondary aerosols. Field studies have included the traffic-related air pollution in Beijing and on the New Jersey Turnpike. His current studies examine mechanisms of surprising neurotoxicity of CO2. So if the panel wants to come up here, and we'll actually start with Howard, because he can give us some unique insights as someone who's done clinical studies and sort of how they can be utilized in helping to inform the NAAQS. What are some of the limitations? What are some of the exciting possibilities with clinical studies and what he's found from his work? So as people are getting sitting down, Howard, I'll give you a second to think about that, and maybe think about what some of the other speakers have said, and then you can give us some of your thoughts on this. So with that, Howard. Not yet. I think he has to control it. Try it now. Try it now.
Hello? Okay. Thank you, Ted. Well, I wasn't completely sure of how to prepare for this, so I thought that what I would start to do is explain how we do controlled exposure chamber studies, and then open things up for questions rather than describing all the studies Ted just mentioned. First of all, I apologize. I didn't bring pictures, at least of our exposure chamber, so you could see what it looks like. But it's basically, in our case, a stainless steel box about 10 by 10 by 10, where we can control what people breathe inside of it, whether it's a pollutant or temperature, humidity, and whatnot. The first such device that I'm aware of that did this was built by David Bates, who used to hang out around this conference at the University of at McGill University at the time, and he was studying, think of this, ozone back in the early 1960s. But anyways, when we design studies based on a controlled exposure, the first thing we have to do is figure out what question we're trying to answer. Is it a question of biological plausibility? Is it a question of dose response? Are we looking for a threshold? What kinds of activities do we think of? Our subjects, we need to characterize them in terms of their age and their health status. If we're studying ozone, do we want people who already are asthmatic, or do we want people who don't have asthma? We need to control the concentration of the pollutant we're interested in, and also whether there are any co-pollutants. Are we interested in more than one? Or as Ted mentioned, we've studied secondary organic aerosols that resulted from mixing low levels of ozone with pinene, like limonene and lemon scent. Once we have our subjects and characterize them in terms of sex, age, and diagnosis, we want to look at the concentration of the chemicals we're looking for. Are we looking for those just down at a threshold, or are we looking for higher levels? Right now, we're doing studies where we're just recruiting subjects, healthy subjects, and for a study looking at their macrophage, how their macrophages function, and we're not really interested in precise ozone levels or low ozone levels that would inform the NAAQS. We're interested in how a model pollutant, ozone, affects the function of macrophages from a basic science point of view. I haven't talked about the duration of the exposure, which is very important, as you've heard discussed before, and the activity of the subjects. By having subjects exercise, we increase the amount of pollutant that they breathe in a given amount of time, and that's a variable we always try to account for. The time of year is important. When we're studying ozone, ozone has relatively high ambient levels in the warm months and not so high in the colder months. And ozone's also a pollutant that there's a certain amount of adaptation towards. So if we study people in the warm months when their ambient day-to-day exposure, not a part of the chamber, is an issue, then we will get different results than if we study them in the colder season. We actually run our studies in the colder season for the macrophages because we want to get maximum bang for our buck, as it were. The levels we run at are far higher than those discussed today, about 200 parts per billion or 0.2 parts per million, and that is approved by our IRB. And interestingly enough, I was going to save this, but in terms of subject variability, we've run about 40 subjects through our protocol, and we monitor their FEV1 before, after. We've never had a lowered FEV1 until last week. We had two separate episodes. People actually lowered their FEV1 by 20% and had symptoms. It's got to be variability in the subjects. We went and rechecked our exposures because we were kind of concerned about that. But it just shows, again, the thing that's been mentioned, which is the heterogeneity of subjects. Anyways, we have to pick our outcome. Is it symptoms? Is it physiology? Is it evidence in terms of biological plausibility of inflammation, even in the absence of actual physiological measured airflow change? Reversibility is very important, not only because in terms of making our studies ethical, but also in terms of seeing an effect and documenting it. It is one of the Bradford Hill elements of causation, whether a something is reversible or not. And we have to be concerned about that. Also, outcomes that are reversible are less convincing in terms of being regarded as adverse effects of air pollution, although reversibility, a temporary effect with symptoms in addition gives more weight to the findings. And I think that's what I'll say for now, and leave it open to others to comment or ask questions.
Wonderful. And actually, I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. We only have really about 5 minutes left because we have a hard stop. Sorry about that. So you better rush up and get to the microphone. So Chris.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, a number of us have been thinking about having a panel like this, and it's really exciting to have the panel. And I think it's hopefully the first of more, because I think it's good to have these check-ins. And I just have 2 comments. So one comment is that I think there's 2 main themes that I get out of this panel. One is, research needs, and Evan and Lars did a nice job of reminding everybody that if you go to KSAC's final closure letter on any given NAAQS review, that's their final letter on their last advice on the policy assessment. They always comment on research needs. And also in the final policy assessment, the agency summarizes research needs. So those are great resources for researchers. But I think the second key theme here, which I think is equally important, is the reporting and the communication. That we can have really excellent research, but if you don't report metrics in your research that can be used in the policy assessment, there are cases where we know there's a great study and we just can't make full use of it because it's not adequately reported. And I think that's an equally important theme, and I think Lars did a nice job and of showing you, like, here are things we want to see in these studies. So I just want to highlight that, and I think that's a conversation we need to continue to have and to refresh all of ourselves on that. The second comment was related to things Joshua said about monitor citing and the representativeness of the monitor relative to exposures. And I think that touches on an issue that comes up in NAAQS review that was alluded to, is the difference between the design value and the exposures in, say, epi studies or chamber studies. And that crosswalk between exposure and design value is one I think it's worth having more conversation about. So anyway, just want to make those comments, but thank you so much for this session.
Thank you, Chris. And you talked about closure letters from KSAC. So with that, Leanne.
Yeah, well, I guess most everybody here knows that I'm chair of KSAC right now for a few more months. I'm also at the University of Washington, and thank you. I appreciate this session. I wanted to say a couple of things and follow up on a couple of comments. I guess I can start with Chris's, since he brought up design values, and I was a little bit, I guess I'm a little bit clear on how important it is that epi studies need to be below the design values. As we saw with Rachel's work, there's ways of doing analyses so you can see effects at the lower levels from epi studies, even in places where they aren't below the design values. So I think that's not as big a limitation for the evidence and for bringing it into the policy. The design values may be more important for risk and exposure assessment, although I need to be maybe convinced a little bit more of that. Following up on what Howard said about controlled human exposure studies, one of the important insights that the recent ozone reconsideration came up with is that controlled human exposure studies really shouldn't be used to determine the lower bound for the evidence. They don't have the right populations, and they don't necessarily have the right exposures, and they can't be big enough, and so they really shouldn't be used as the evidence in policy for determining the lower bound, which is the example we saw from Lars today. Yeah, I could go on, but since there's not much more, I would, in time for this session, I would also say that KSAC gave some pretty important process advice about considering alternative standards in all your reviews. And it would be worth also thinking about the role of the risk and exposure assessment, since typically that's a draft, and then the PA is a draft, and then if there's only one draft, there's not any time to iterate. And given the importance of the form and the indicator and the level, you know, having more opportunity to iterate on the risk and exposure assessment may be extremely important for policy.
Thank you, Leanne. Did you all want to have a quick response, or? No? Okay.
Anna Morales, Weld County. We have a bunch of data. Where do you want it? There's so many networks of data. So what is the best place to get this data to all the researchers doing all these variety of things?
I think that's a really open question, right?
You can.
Test, check, okay. I think it's a really open question where we can, I think we need better data sharing platforms for a lot of these observations, and probably on the health side too, that I don't think we have great data exchanges for this kind of stuff right now.
I'd be remiss not to mention, I'm on the NIH Climate and Health Research Coordinating Center group, and we're encouraging folks, if possible, we have a lot of guidance on depositing data to public repositories, but we specifically use a Dataverse repository, and we're encouraging folks to, when possible, start to submit data there so that they can be sort of widely accessed and in a single location.
And last, but and it better be quick.
One last quick little question. Back in the EJ and cumulative impact sections, we heard this critique that the policy system is problematic because it focuses on one pollutant at a time, one risk at a time, doesn't focus on cumulative impacts. Is that a fair critique? I have my own thoughts. I want to see especially what the OAQPS folks think and what the epidemiologists think, and how would you respond to that critique?
So always a last easy question, right, Chad? I think in the NAAQS context, we have to be realistic, and the Clean Air Act is giving us a lot of direction. And so I think both from the perspective of the Clean Air Act and given time, I think we have to be realistic and focus on one pollutant at a time. Of course, it's a national ambient air quality standard. Is your question appropriate from the perspective of multiple impacts and perhaps not at a national standard? Absolutely, and I hope research continues to that. I hope it can, perhaps inform what we do with the NAAQS, but we are directed by the Clean Air Act, and we've got to focus on one pollutant at a time so that we're actually getting some meaningful work completed too.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add. I think that's well summarized. I would just say from a research perspective, when we're evaluating the science, we're obviously interested in the independent effect of one pollutant at a time, but to the extent that the research is available, we also try to put that into the context where we see multi-pollutant models or effect modification by other pollutants. So that research is certainly useful. The NAAQS standard setting is sort of its own beast, so.
And with that, I think we have to call this session to a close, and I'll pass the mic to Elena.